I'll introduce our amazing moderator tonight, Anelise Chen, who I'm super pleased is here with us. Um, Anelise is the author of this really great book called So Many Olympic Exertions. It's a blend of sports writing, memoir, and self-help that you didn't know that you really needed in your life. This is a book that basically everyone on our staff read and loves. Every year we do this thing where we have like kind of a roundup of our favorite books of the year on the website, and this was one. And I just wanted to quote the words of my colleague Rob, who's doing our AV tonight. He says, "Reading so many Olympic exertions makes me feel like I've been being John Malkovich'd into the head of a wonderfully obsessive and grieving observer. It's an experimental novel in form, jumping from first person to third person, journal entries, idea fragments, and always maintains a close, sometimes claustrophobic connection to the narrator. And I love it." I feel the same way. I also encourage just reading interviews with Annalise. That book is kind of about like going on and quitting, and interviews with Annalise, if you feel like you need help to quit something, they're good at encouraging you to take that step. She expounds beautifully on the virtues of giving up, but also writes books, so doesn't give up. She wrote an incredible column on mollusks for the Paris Review, and her essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, NPR, Bomb, The New Republic, Vice, The Village Voice, and many other publications. A former Open City Fellow of the workshop, she now teaches at Columbia University, and she will be introducing our amazing readers tonight. Thanks so much.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. It's so good to see all of you. Okay, so I'm just going to go into the intros so we have more time to talk. So Alexander Chee. Alexander Chee is the author of the novels Edinburgh, The Queen of the Night, and now the essay collection How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. He is the recipient of a Whiting Award, an NEA, and has received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, VCCA, Civitella, Ranieri, and Amtrak. He's an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. So Alex I've admired for years and years and years for his courage and his prose and his unrelenting commitment to our community here at AAWW. I actually met him for the first time in 2011 when I was an Open City Fellow, and we were at a party for Salman Rushdie. Well, actually, Alex was invited to the party, and I was just pouring champagne. But anyway, it was like so magical for me to be in that milieu, and Alex was so generous. You know, you were so generous with your time and talking to me. And so afterward, I got Edinburgh to read because I was a little bit starstruck, and I was thinking like, you know, I'm always a little bit ambivalent reading the books of people I meet in real life and really like because, you know, sometimes like they seem really awesome in person and then their writing's not good. Or or their writing is amazing and then you meet them in person and you wish you hadn't. But anyway, Alex is one of the rare cases where he's amazing in both arenas. And so Edinburgh turned out to be a very important book for me, and it's one of those books that really give you confidence to write the book that you really want to write, and the book that's uncompromised and that really sticks. You know, that it has a vision. So thank you for that, and then I'll introduce Aminatta, and then they'll both read. Okay, Aminatta Forna was born in Scotland, raised in Sierra Leone and Great Britain, and spent periods of her childhood in Iran, Thailand, and Zambia. She is the award-winning author of the novels The Hired Man, The Memory of Love, and Ancestor Stones, and a memoir, The Devil That Danced on the Water. Aminatta has won many, many prizes, including the Wyndham Campbell Award. She's currently Lannan Visiting Chair of Poetics at Georgetown University and Professor of Creative Writing at Bath Spa University. That sounds really great. It's not a bath or a spa or a university. I'm so excited for you to read Aminatta's book. So I was invited to moderate this, and so I had to read the books, and I read half of it in one sitting, and which was very unwise because I had to prepare for job talk. But it's that kind of book, and so if I don't get this job, I'm. um, it's happy. The book is called Happiness. Happiness is, among many things, the ways we're all bound to each other across nationality, age, race, and the animals in our midst, including each other. So, Aminatta?
Thank you. So I'm not American, and I'm not Asian. I'm an Afro-European, or Euro-African. But I think we have a great, both Alex and I have a great commonality in being transnational folk who've lived in different places. And I think we're going to be talking a lot about that later. So what I'm going to do now is just move straight into the reading without any preamble. Happiness. Chapter 1, London, Sunday the 2nd of February 2014, evening. At that time of day, Waterloo Bridge is busy with shoppers and weekend workers who make their way on foot across the bridge to Waterloo Station. At that time of year, too, dusk comes early, by 4 in the afternoon. By 5 it is dark. The fox wended its way through the pedestrians, who for the most part paid it no heed, for they would not so easily be distracted from their fixity of purpose. Through the slanting sleet, many people didn't see the fox. Those who did thought it was perhaps a loose dog. A few people had observed the fox on its journey. Upon the terrace of the National Theatre, a pair of smokers had spotted the fox, watching them from behind the corner of a raised concrete flower bed that was filled with dead lavender. The smokers and the fox looked at each other in stillness for several seconds. Then 3 things happened which caused the fox to bolt. A passing cruiser on the river gave a blast of its horn, which in turn caused one of the smokers to utter a high-pitched "oh!" of surprise. This startled the fox, which backed off, and might have done little more than run down the stairs to the next level had not, third, a plastic bag dislodged from a tree branch by a sudden gust of wind, borne suddenly down upon the terrace. Moments before all this happened, another smoker, this is London, everyone smokes. I couldn't say it in San Francisco. Moments before all this happened, another smoker had emerged from the theatre lobby and now stood with the heavy door propped upon one shoulder for use as a windshield while she lit a cigarette. The fox, escaping the threat of the carrier bag, dashed through the open door and into the lobby, where it joined the lava flow of departing theatre-goers. Down the stairs and through the crowd went the fox, and as it went, it brushed against calves and knees, causing people to hop, exclaim, and search the floor through the thicket of legs for the cause. Down on the ground floor, the fox skittered across the down on the ground level, the fox skittered across the hard floor. A young man selling programs for the evening show pointed and cried, "There!" in a kind of outrage to a pair of security guards who, with a jangle of keys, lumbered into life. The fox headed for the glass doors leading to the outside. Onlookers stopped to watch. Talk stalled to silence. Between the bank of glass doors and the concrete walls of the building, the fox had nowhere to go. On the other side of the glass, a man, painted top to toe in silver, carrying a silver cane and wearing a silver bowler hat, and who'd spent 8 hours standing motionless upon a box in the freezing temperatures of the day, approached the building with no idea of the commotion unfolding beyond. Just as the fox reached the last in the row of doors, the silver man pulled it open. The fox ran out. The security guard skidded to a stop. One nearly fell over. The other uttered an exclamation in Yoruba. Both laughed and adjusted their peaked caps. One clapped his companion upon the shoulder. Some people broke into a scattering of applause, and the silver man took a bow. Outside, the smell in the air was of river water and traffic fumes. The fox ran up the stone steps to the bridge where it overtook a man carrying a bicycle. On the bridge, people walked unswervingly, armed with bags, defended by earphones, looking neither right nor left and acknowledging nothing and nobody. Those who did not walk with purpose meandered in pairs, rocks around which the faster walkers flowed. Past a cameraman taking a time-lapse image of the river, the fox moved at a metronomic trot. Moving at a metronomic trot wove a line through them all. A man, so tall he appeared to be wading through the crowd, was crossing the bridge in the opposite direction to the fox. The man's name, the name his mother had given him as though she knew to what size her only son would one day grow, was Attila. In his pocket, Attila carried a theatre ticket. In addition, he held a reservation for one at a theatre in the Aldwych. He had chosen the restaurant after reading the menu displayed outside the entrance, and now his reverie was of boiled beef taffel-spits and chopped chicken salad. Attila was newly arrived in the country by no more than a few hours, and he relished for the moment the feel of wind and sleet on his face. He relished, too, the idea that soon he would sit alone in a dark place, surrounded by strangers, where nobody could find him. He moved slowly in the crowd, letting people pass. In the middle of the bridge, just beyond the cameraman standing with his camera on a tripod, Attila came to a stop and turned to admire the view of the Houses of Parliament. Somebody ran into him. The collision left Attila unhurt, a testament to his scale and size. By contrast, the woman who'd run into him was thrown to the ground, and Attila promptly bent to help her up. He apologized in sympathy, for obviously this could not be his fault. The woman accepted his hand, stood up and brushed her backside. She wore jeans and a sweater and jacket, all in black. Attila retrieved a black day pack from the ground and held it out to her, but she left him holding on to it for some moments while she retied her hair into its ponytail. As he waited, Attila noticed two things about the woman. First, that her hair was a rather remarkable pale silver and hung to the middle of her back, or would have done, were she not already in the act of pushing it up inside a woolen hat. Secondly, that she was tall for a woman. She nearly reached his chin. The woman put her hand out so Attila might pass her bag, swung it onto her shoulder and said, "I'm so sorry about that, do excuse me," in a way that suggested no particular sorrow at all. Attila nodded. A moment later he watched her walk away, her long strides. He could still feel the force of their collision, the imprint of her body on his. Later in the theatre, Attila drank a gin and tonic and forgot about the woman on the bridge. The show was a comedy, and he laughed explosively at all the jokes until he had to wipe away the tears that rolled down his face. At the interval, he bought himself a vanilla ice cream. He came to London infrequently, but regularly enough to form certain habits. Late morning, Attila had checked into his preferred hotel. The early part of the evening he'd spent walking and buying theatre tickets. Now from the terrace he searched the skyline for changes and identified two new skyscrapers to the right of St. Paul's Cathedral, one with a single sloped side, the other a concave structure. They'd been built since the time of his last visit to the city 2 years ago. In the middle of Waterloo Bridge stood an engraved plaque of the skyline, and Attila made a mental note to check it for the names of the new buildings. As he finished his ice cream, the bell sounded, and he turned with fresh anticipation to take his seat in the auditorium. On his way back across the bridge, Attila was driven by hunger and failed to check the plaque. A few minutes later, he was being shown to his seat by the maitre d' of his chosen restaurant. As he followed, Attila glanced covertly at the plates of the other diners. He liked and at times even asked to be seated near the kitchen, a request so unusual it could always be accommodated. This way he had sight of the plates of food held aloft by the waiters as they emerged through the double doors. In places where he was known, the waiters would sometimes pass by his table, dipping each dish to waft in front of his nose. "Tagliolini ai funghi porcini freschi, signor." "Steamed whole tilapia, Dr. Asari." "Today's prime-aged porterhouse steak, sir." Despite the late hour, the restaurant was full. Booths lined the walls, and in the centre, like water lilies, an array of small and large tables, covered in white tablecloths. Attila was shown to a corner booth. The maitre d' pulled the table out a good way to allow him to slide onto the banquette. He said good evening to the people at the next table and picked up the menu to remind himself of the good things on offer. He ordered calves' liver and bacon because both of these were hard to come by where he lived, and the potted brown shrimps because these too were a rare treat. A carafe of Rioja completed his choice. And as he waited for his meal to arrive, he sipped wine and looked around at the other clientele. With the exception of a couple seated at one of the water lilies, everyone in the restaurant was white. Attila watched the single black couple for a while. They were young and close in conversation. The woman wore a fuchsia dress. The man was in a suit. An anniversary, thought Attila, and looked away. Some minutes later, as Attila was eating brown shrimp, the man walked past Attila's table. And a few minutes later, on his way back from the gents, he passed by again. This time Attila happened to look up and catch his eye. The man nodded, single dip of the chin. Attila nodded back and returned to his shrimp. The nod was something that was exchanged only in certain places. Moscow, for example, Perth, Prague. Sao Paulo? No. Havana? No. Mumbai? Yes. Rome? Less and less often. All of Poland. Much of England beyond the M25. Belfast? Yes. In London? More rarely, although a nod might be exchanged in certain kinds of establishment. In this restaurant, Attila drew no stares, but it was still a place the nod might occur. He might have been tired, but he was not. There was no question of jet lag, for there was no time difference between Accra and London, but he'd flown overnight. On the plane, he'd used the time to review the papers for the conference and details of his keynote speech, which, though he'd delivered it often in the past few years, nevertheless required updating. Attila possessed the gift of being able to choose when and whether to sleep, one that served him well on various tours of duty, when sleep was impossible, when the environment was too hostile or the victims too many. Out in the field, he could forfeit sleep to work long days, interviewing, assessing, collecting data, and then sleep for a 14-hour stretch back at the hotel. He never waited to return to base to draft his report, but began it then and there, as soon as he woke and while the thoughts were fresh. Following dinner, when it was by then after midnight, Attila walked briskly back in the direction of the bridge. Exercise and a little air were the things he needed now. Taxis passed him without slowing. The brutal concrete theatre buildings and galleries on the opposite bank were lit blue and red. The plaque was mounted at the balustrade, on the balustrade at the apex of the bridge, and faced east towards the river estuary. The engraving was worn, the lettering faded, and it had been defaced by a scrawl of graffiti. But the moon was good that night, and Attila bent and traced the skyline with his forefinger. The two new buildings, though, had not yet been added. He turned to walk back the way he'd come. Tonight he would sleep well. In his mind, he was already planning the breakfast he would order in the hotel dining room. When he was away, in the places where he worked, places lost in the moral darkness, London seemed unreal and distant. Even street lighting struck him as an improbable luxury, lights left burning so the population of a city could walk home without fear of injury or crime. When he was in London, going to see plays and eating in fine restaurants, the city itself began to feel like a stage set whose denizens enacted their lives against its magnificent backdrop, a theatre of delights where nothing surely could go wrong, and if it did, all would be put right by the end of the third act. He stepped up his pace and clapped his hands as if in anticipation of what lay ahead, but in reality against the cold. On the empty bridge, an animal was trotting towards him, a shifting shape that slid in and out of the light and dark. At first Attila thought it was a cat, and then a dog, until finally the moving shape resolved into the form of a fox. The fox passed Attila by, carving a shallow arc around him. Attila walked on and then stopped and turned around. At the same time, the fox too stopped and glanced back over its shoulder and seemed to regard him. Attila pushed his hands into the pockets of his coat. The fox held his gaze, unblinking for a long moment, then turned and trotted on. Thank you.
I do love a novel about a fox. So I thought I would read tonight from On Becoming an American Writer, which is the last essay from this collection, and it borrows a title from an essay by James Allen McPherson, who was a teacher of mine in Iowa, who wrote this, I think, truly incredible essay about the 14th Amendment. This is one of these essays in the collection that I have been struggling with for years. There's about 4 of them in here that I had left unfinished for anywhere between 10 and 20 years. Girl is one that, for example, I wrote a draft of it in 1994 and then revised it a few times that year and then just abandoned it for 20 years. Not really sure why, but maybe I'll write an essay about it. I get at it a little bit in here, actually. But. How many times have I thought the world would end? This was the question that appeared in my head the morning after the election that for now we all speak of only as the election, as if there will never be any other. The question appeared like a black balloon determined to follow me around, bobbing in and out of my vision, a response to my first thought, this is the end of the world. I was standing in my kitchen at the stove. I was supposed to teach a class that morning. Canceling the class seemed out of the question, though I did not know how to do all the things that would get me there. The coffee seemed impossible to make, as did breakfast, going downstairs, getting into the car, driving the 20 minutes south to the college where I teach, walking into the classroom. I couldn't imagine any of that. What I did imagine: a white supremacist, evangelical, Christian, theocratic, militaristic government, my Muslim friends rounded up and deported, being hunted by right-wing militias for being gay or for being mixed race, or both. Climate departure, the next step after climate change, when the weather turns in violent shifts, monsoons and blizzards, floods and freezing. The ocean a hot soup, empty of life, government imposed to environmental protections, labor protections, abortion, birth control, equal access to health care. I knew, in shock. The previous night, when the results seemed final, my partner of 8 years had proposed marriage, and I had accepted. We decided to marry before the laws could be changed. I knew it would be help if we ever needed to seek asylum. Before this, my now husband had expressed a deep antipathy to even the idea of marriage. My sister had called afterward, distraught, having just been able to put her children to bed. They had begged her to move, to leave the country. That had all happened between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. My phone was in my hand. A tingling and numbness ran down from the top of my left shoulder all the way to where my phone digs into my palm, pushing on a nerve there when I scrolled with one hand, as I did, walking from room to room in disbelief and horror. This is what I was doing just before I came to stop in the kitchen. The pain that began that day lasted almost a year. I checked Facebook, an autonomic response. What will you teach? My friend, the poet Solmaz Sharif, had posted. What will I teach? What do I know? This somehow brought me out of my trance, but I was still motionless in front of my stove. Can you make coffee? I asked myself. No. Can you buy a coffee? Yes. Go buy a coffee, I told myself. I put on a coat. I got my coffee and a breakfast sandwich and drove south to the school. The views along Interstate 91 of the White Mountains and the Green Mountains usually console me, but that day all I could think about on that drive was the death of the world. I arrived in the college's town to find it as empty as if classes were canceled. I walked to my office. A young woman left the library and crossed the strangely empty lawn. As she drew closer, I saw tears streaming down her face. She did not look at me. In my office, as I collected the materials for class, I overheard another young woman crying as she described her anger to a colleague about the future in a country that had elected a sexual predator as president. What will you teach? It felt as if a president had been assassinated, but the president was alive. Instead, the country we thought we would be living in was dead, as if a president had assassinated a country. I walked into my classroom. My students were all present. The room was very quiet and tense, as if they were trying to find a way to tell me one of them had died. Many of them were crying or had just stopped crying. I hadn't been sure if any of them would be celebrating the new president before this, but now it was clear none of them were. I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen, I said. Let's just talk about whatever it is we need to talk about. What is the point? One of my most talented students asked after the shortest pause. What is the point even of writing if this can happen? The day the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, I was at my alma mater, Wesleyan University, preparing to teach the next day. In the art professor's apartment I was subletting, I watched the news of the invasion in his antique television, the screen the size of a paperback book. I was surrounded by art as a segment aired declaring that the museum's antiquities of the ancient Persian culture preceding Saddam Hussein would likely be destroyed by American shelling. The country's historic legacy lost, perhaps forever. To these concerns, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was shown responding to this. He offered, "What's a few less old pots?" He was chipper, even affable, as he said it. He thought he was funny. Yes, who wants them? Who wants any of it? A strange chill dropped over me, a sort of shadow felt even in the night. How cheerful he was as he consigned these parts of one of the world's oldest cultures, the source of so much of our art, literature, and science, to rubble. I turned off the television and sat alone and angry in the cold apartment, a pile of manuscripts to mark next to me. What was the point? The task of being a writer suddenly felt inadequate, as did I. That next morning at Wesleyan, I faced something entirely new in my teaching career. I didn't know what to say to my students, and I very much wanted to know. My generation of writers, and yours if you are reading this, lives in the shadow of Auden's famous attack on the relevance of writing to life when he wrote that poetry makes nothing happen. I'd heard the remark repeated so often and for so long, I finally went looking for its source to try to understand what it was he really meant by it, because I knew it was time for me to really argue with it, if not for myself, for my students. Auden wrote this line in an elegy for Yeats, and Yeats, it should be said, was a hero of Auden's. To read the whole poem is to know he meant, if not the opposite of what this line is so often used to say, something at least more subtle, an ironic complaint. This isn't even the sharpest line Auden wrote on the subject, but somehow the line handed anyone who cared a weapon to gut the confidence of over 50 years' worth of writers in the West. As we face the inexorable creep of William F. Buckley's intellectual conservatism that used anti-intellectualism as its arrowhead, this attitude that writing is powerless is one that affects you even if you have never read that poem, much less that quote. Pundits, reviewers, critics spit it out repeatedly, as often now as ever, hazing anyone who might imagine anything to the contrary. I don't blame Auden or Yeats, who had both hoped to inspire political change with their poetry earlier in their lives. His poem meant to express his disillusionment. I don't think Auden meant it as a call to stop trying. But America was a young enough country. American literature was young also. It was easier to believe that we were wrong than to believe what writers around the world believe, that we matter, and that it is our duty to matter. Students often ask me whether I think they can be a writer. I tell them I don't know. Because it depends first and foremost on whether you want to be one. The question is not as simple to answer as it seems. Difficulties are many, even if you truly want to be a writer. What seems to separate those who write from those who don't is being able to stand it. I started with writers more talented than me, Annie Dillard had said in the class I took from her in college. And they're not writing anymore. I am. I remember as a student thinking, why wouldn't you do the work? What could possibly stop you? Sorry. Bitter laughter. That's not in the essay. I began teaching writers in the fall of 1996 at a continuing education program based on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I called it the MASH unit of creative writing because you can't turn anyone away from your classes there. The program pays instructors what it has always paid them, even now, 20 years later, and they do so because there is always an MFA graduate like me who needs a first teaching job. And every other place that offers writing classes in New York is more or less like this. But I loved my students, and what I still value of this experience is that it was there that I first discovered that good writing was, as Annie had said to us, teachable. Talent mattered less than it was made to seem to matter. I watched in my first classes as I applied techniques I'd been taught to students who seemed at first to be unlikely writers, and they turned into excellent ones. I learned a different kind of humility there in the face of their efforts, which I still think serves me as a teacher. You don't know who will make it and who will not. And students' previous work may or may not be an indicator of what they can do, good or bad. Most of what Annie had taught me was about habits of mind and habits of work. As long as these continued, I imagined, so would the writing. I will always want my students to know that if what you write matters enough, it makes no difference where you write it, or if you have a desk, or if you have quiet, and so on. If the essay or novel or poem wants to be written, it will speak to you while the conductor is calling out the streets. The question is, will you listen? And listen regularly. Teaching these classes, I also learned what could stop a writer. So many of the students in my classes were stuck. Some were struggling with a story they both wanted to tell and had forbidden themselves from telling. Some were struggling with a family story that they believed, if told, would destroy their family, or them, or their relationship to the family. A close friend to this day will not write the novel he wants to write about his late mother, who was closeted until he came out to her, and then she came out to him. He's afraid of the reaction of a single cousin. Why does the talented student of writing stop? It is usually the imagination, turned to creating a story in which you are a failure, and all you have done has failed, and you are made out to be the fraud you feared you are. You can imagine the story you might tell, or you can imagine this other story. Both will be extraordinarily detailed, but only one will be something you can publish. The other will freeze you in place in a private theater of pain that seats one. These writers are, in many cases, people who know how to write. What they don't know is how to become unstuck, how to leave that theater they made for themselves, how to stop telling themselves the story that freezes them. I discovered I needed to teach not just how to write, but how to keep writing, how to face up to who you think is listening. Is the person listening more important than you? Or is the story you would tell more important than you? I was teaching how to stand up and leave that room in your mind so you can go and write and live. But the question after that always is, live with what? And one answer was always going to be America. When I was a student of writing in college, I was guilty of believing that I would have the sort of life of an author that proceeded along lines that kept me well within the limits of the middle class. It is the American art trap. Make art, but be a good member of your social class. A friend of mine even has the belief that I think is worth testing, that the primary deciding factor of whether a writer becomes a writer is their relationship to being middle class. If they are working class or upper class, or even an aristocrat, they are at least comfortable betraying that class in order to write. Put another way, will you be able to write and also eat, or even eat well? Will you have to work another job? Will you be able to pay for health care, a house, dental work, retirement? These fantasies frayed and fell apart fast enough as the two places I chose to focus my career, writing and teaching, have both met with extraordinary income destruction in the last 2 decades. I learned quickly that if you stop writing, nothing happens. But I also learned that I had nowhere else to go. I mastered my diligence in the face of that, but I am still not free of the demon that can stop me in my tracks and make me doubt my sense of my own worth and power. And there isn't even just a single demon, nor are they only personal ones at that. You are up against what people will always call the ways of the world, and the ways of this country, which does not kill artists so much as it kills the rationale for art, in part by insisting that the artist must be a successful member of the middle class, if not a celebrity, to be a successful artist, and that to do otherwise is to fail art, the country, and yourself. Should you decide that writing is your way to serve your country or to defend it, you are almost always writing about the country it could become. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Hello. So I swear I wasn't going to ask you this until later, but since you read that essay, I feel justified. So the question I want to ask you is about this "what is the point" problem. So you just read that essay, but Aminatta, I was thinking about that scene where Jean is the main character, and she's sort of doing a survey on urban foxes in London. She goes on a radio show to get the message out about the urban foxes, and then you think this isn't going to be a partisan issue, but it quickly becomes a partisan issue. And just how sad that is. Like, you can't even talk about foxes without it becoming just. And they said the craziest things. So anyway, my question is, what is the role of art and literature in these sad times?
Actually, I don't share the despondency. I'm British, but I'm also Sierra Leonean. And Sierra Leone has had, in the last 40 years, has gone through a series of difficulties. Numerous coups, military juntas, more coups, a war. And so in that sense, I mean, actually, to take it to thinking about your essay and the night of the election, everybody I know, including myself, who thought that there was a very good chance that Donald Trump was going to win, came from a country where they had seen a demagogue rise, right? And my American friends were all saying, no, it can't happen here. And then they told me things about the Electoral College, which just confused me. So I just said, well, I'm totally a numer. I don't understand your system, but I'll tell you this: if I put my finger in the wind, this guy could win, because the mood in this country is such. I wrote an essay which, I gave a keynote speech which I published as an essay, and it was entitled "Where Are the West's Political Writers?" And I gave it at Grub Street at their conference. And I was arguing that that every other country regarded writing as a political act, not necessarily, but often, and the artist, the writer, as a political being. And yet the West had somehow eschewed this idea and was focused very much on the notion that art for art's sake was all that mattered, and that politics compromised any kind of political idea underlying a theme, compromised the aesthetic of the work. And I didn't feel that at all. I feel that a work lives or fails on its own merits, but whether it has a political content is not part of it. But there was always this kind of cheap jibe, well, it's soapboxing. Well, it shouldn't be soapboxing. There are ways of doing this. Now, in the essay, I asked the question, and I think of this with Sierra Leone and many other countries, the South American countries, the other African countries, the Asian countries. If it matters so little, if art matters so little, but if in particular if writing matters so little, why do they kill us first? Right? Why do they imprison and kill the writers so fast? It's because it does matter, and it's because the writers can galvanize first the middle class, but also the working class. That's what Wole Soyinka did. That's what Ngugi wa Thiong'o did. You know, so writing does matter, and it's kind of interesting. I'm putting together a collection of essays for publication in a year or so, and we've looked at that essay. It's become redundant. Because suddenly every American writer who previously was of the view that writing shouldn't be a political act is suddenly of the view it should be a political act. So we've had this complete turnaround, and the essay now feels redundant. But I do feel, well, you know, at least that happened. At least that happened. It matters.
So the next section of the essay that I was reading from is actually about how they kill the writers first.
Right. You tell your students that.
I do. I do. I teach them that now. But in the context of that, I think, you know, a novel, should it survive a missile, protects what a missile can. You know, and that's the sort of that's the kind of role that, I mean, part of the reason for dedicating this in part to Jim McPherson was that, like, he actually was trying at the Iowa Writers Workshop to teach us that we had this role, that it was like, the way he put it to us was, it's on you to rewrite the myths of the country for the next generation, you know. And at the time I was like, that is a lot to think about. You know, when you're 25, you just, I suppose it depends on where your pride and courage find their root, you know, but I also didn't entirely understand when he first introduced the idea what he was talking about, but it was in the context of a course on, like, how to use myth in a piece of writing. And gradually over the course of time, I came to understand that his attention to myth was his attention to the rules of a culture which are inscribed in a myth. And the reason why you rewrite the myth is because you want to rewrite the culture. That you're sort of, you're pursuing a kind of different idea of the author in that sense. But I think there is, you know, when I was trying to workshop my first stories, I was often trying to write about political people, activists, and I was often greeted with this kind of, like, you know, if you want to send a message, send a telegram kind of bullshit. And as if, like, writing about activists wasn't allowed because of this rule against writing about politics, you know. Like, you were doing something that ranged anywhere from the tacky to the rude by introducing it. And I think, you know, with some reflection, I'm pretty sure it's the role the CIA had in the culture. These, like, stories that we are getting now of the way in which the CIA and the State Department funded different literary institutions and pursued a kind of, like, cultural soft power through the spread of art that offered the pose of not having any politics in it.
How interesting. So you neutralize the writers. You sort of kill them with kindness.
Yes, if the writers don't matter, you don't have to kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And America it became a country where the first condition of being a writer was that you had to agree not to matter.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I was gonna say that thing about CIA probably having something to do with it. But I was thinking how stories are so useful for providing a platform for talking about political things. Like I was just teaching McPherson's story, A Loaf of Bread, which is such a great story because it's about, like, this like a shopkeeper who jacks up his prices in the African American community, and then, like, it's a lot cheaper in the predominantly white community. And so we had such a good sort of discussion about it in class. And then we also read this John Edgar Wideman story, The Writing Teacher, which is really interesting because it's about the ethics of, so he has, the story is about a student who wants to write from the perspective of a single mom in poverty, and she, you know, she has very good intentions and like the ethics about, around that. So I mean, those are two very political, I would say, stories, even though it doesn't tell us what to think about either issue. So anyway, I think stories are really useful for that. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about this in the context recently of like, because I'm trying to write this essay about Ghost at a Watchman and To Kill a Mockingbird, and there's this, in America, the role of the political novel was more or less consigned to what we think of as like young adult fiction. The problem novel was sort of what it was often called, you know, and it was this kind of, you know, if you look at Ghost at a Watchman, the conversation around it was like, you know, what she had of her mind to publish it. She was, when you read it, you realize she was trying to write about white moderate complicity and white supremacy. I mean, she was doing it in this way that was terrifying also to read. And we're also in a way, when you looked at it, it wasn't clear on whether she knew that's what she was doing. You know, so it was a very eerie reading experience. Not at all like the way that you feel when you read To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, where the story feels drawn along clearer moral lines. And so I was trying to imagine like what would America have been if that had been the novel that she had finished first, you know, had been encouraged to finish first. But instead, an editor drew a circle around like 2 paragraphs of backstory in Ghost at a Watchman and said, write about that, you know, and that's what became To Kill a Mockingbird. So it's a really eerie story in the context of this like depoliticization of the novel, you know, and of fiction and art and the like. But I guess, you know, listening to your excerpt, you know, so one of the things I love about Happiness is the fox in it is such a beautiful character, really, or the foxes. Is it? I mean, I think of it as one fox, but really it's not.
Yeah, there are a couple of foxes.
There's a couple of
London's
foxes.
overrun with foxes, in fact, but
Right.
there are 2.
It's one of the things I like about London.
Yeah, I love that about London.
And I wondered, I guess, if you could talk a little bit about how did you decide you were going to include the fox?
Foxes. Oh, because
And
they...
the politicization of it.
Well, it took a while. So you were talking about putting your books away, your essays away for 10 or 20 years, although you look a bit young for that, I have to say. But unless you started writing at 5. But I mean, it takes me a long time to produce the idea for a book. You know, it just sort of ruminates and ruminates and ruminates. And I actually, and usually I have an idea and then I write a whole nother book in between. And then the other one is, you know, comes back again later. But the foxes, really, actually, I watch them in my garden. You know, I have a big garden, and I live in Virginia now, but I have a big garden, by London standards, let me put it that way, garden in London. And when we moved in our house, we were the people, the gentrifiers, who came in, bought a house that was falling down, did it up again, tidied up the garden. And we were told that the fox had her cubs in our garden, a vixen. And actually, she sort of moved her den around a bit, but basically every year for 18 years, I watched fox cubs grow up, and they'd come and play on my lawn. And my study overlooks the garden. And I became more and more moved to write about urban animals in general because of, as Lisa said, the extraordinary ability for this issue to become partisan. I mean, you know, some people hate the foxes, some people love the foxes. These 2 groups of people are at war in the most extraordinary way. And you know, the haters just will not listen to reason. And it's quite fascinating how the rhetoric mirrors the rhetoric around so many other things when a newspaper decides to target a group. You know, they bring disease, they cause crime. You know, one fox is held responsible for, every fox is held responsible for one fox doing something. You know, a child gets bitten, you think, oh, I hope it's not a fox. You hope it's a dog, and the dogs will. But so it was sort of extraordinary how it kind of mirrored all of these things. And then I happened to move to America at some point when I was thinking about all of this. And you have all your animals here. And, you know, I mean, here, I was at Williams College, and in most places in America, it's coyote, and they excite even more aggravation than foxes do.
So they make that terrifying noise.
Yeah, well, foxes do too, but for different reasons.
You mimic
But-
the noise.
Mm?
What's the noise that they
The
make?
fox yell. Well, the foxes do it when they're having fun, but or when they're prelude to fun. But the coyotes, this is the coyote call, is a very kind of howling, shrieking, it's banshee sound.
Oh,
I mean,
is that like, oh, that one?
no,
Oh,
it's
that's
even,
wolves.
yeah, that's wolves. Wolves sound sane compared to, well, like a wolf who's inhaled helium.
Yes.
Yeah. You know that. But, you know, I began, and I saw the same thing playing out here, and that really kind of got me thinking about it. And I'll just tell you, now I'm in DC. This is how, I live in Arlington, right, in the DC area. This is how close this metaphor could run. Now it's deer, right, deer. I cannot understand how you can develop a loathing for such a gentle animal. But anyway, set that aside. Where we first moved into our house in DC, there was a doe that used to walk past through our garden. And it was a sort of rather eerie encounter because I smoke. And I would be outside on my stoop having a cigarette. And this deer would pass where that bookshelf is. She'd just walk right past me. And there was a kind of covered veranda, but we were so close to each other. It was very odd. Anyway, we became friendly. And I had a trampoline in the garden, and she would come and lie under the trampoline. By then she had 2 fawns, and they would come and use it as a sunshade in the heat of the day. And I could sit there and read. It would be like, not even where the end of the room is, maybe where the bookseller is. And I would read, and they would lie under there. Well, the woman who had the house below ours became extremely vexed by this deer, this doe and her 2 fawns. I mean, really. And she was the Wicked Witch of the West. And she began to complain to us, and she asked us if we could build a wall at the bottom of our garden. And we said, it's not our garden, because we only rent. So she got hold of the owners, and they lived in Rwanda, and they didn't care. So they said no. So she built the wall herself. And then the deer walked round it, you see. So then she asked the neighbor on this side, could they build a wall? And they were very nice people. The deer ate all their hosta, but they let it go. They said no, they would not help with the wall. So she, with her own money, continued to extend the wall. Do you see where this metaphor is going?
Yes.
Then again, on the other side,
It's very
same
direct.
thing.
It's a very direct.
It's not even a metaphor. 70 foot of wall she put up. It's really a fence, but 70 foot. And I just thought, wow, that much control. It was about control. And I don't think this deer couldn't have been doing anything. She didn't grow hosta. She just had grass. They walked on it. But this enraged her, and I think it was about ownership and control and power and saying, I have this is mine, you are not welcome, I will control your access to this.
We have something like this with bears in the Catskills, where my husband and I share a cabin with another couple, and our place is in a kind of it's a little terrifying, but it's a 1930s era hunting association, so all the cabins were built at the same time, and it is probably like, you know, if you could set a sequel to Get Out there or something. Just from the look of it, but it's a little more wild than that. And now it's mostly like most of the people who live there don't hunt, and there are a few people who pretend that they do still hunt a lot. They hunt a little, you know. But that's a metaphor, I think. Like, we could hunt. We could hunt a lot, you know, but we're not going to, you know. And so there's these bears that are there in the spring, summer, and fall. And my husband and I have become quite fond of them. And everyone is always trying to get the bears out. And there's like, you know, there's a neighbor who counts the bears. How, I'm not really sure. And we have taken to, we like to make drinks at dusk and sit and watch them in the meadow across the way as they eat apples in the apple trees there, and then they get drunk from the apples. We're also getting drunk. And then they fall out of the tree, or maybe they like have a struggle with each other. But they're actually very shy, and if you make too much noise, they run away. And, you know, we don't do anything too dangerous, and we obey all the rules about food and so on. But there is this whole thing of like, you know, now I noticed in the last year or two this conversation around the bears from New Jersey. Because the people in New Jersey are like allegedly, you know, picking up their bears and bringing them to the Catskills and releasing them, which I can't even imagine that that's true. But it's interesting that this is a story, and this is like this kind of where
territorial and
the animal becomes a
a
metaphor,
substitute.
not even a metaphor, a substitute. Yeah, proxy, maybe is a better word for it. Proxy for this other kind of fight.
Yeah, it's good for like looking at an issue sideways, to talk about things that are bothering people. Like, but somehow I feel like animals always become metaphors, and I was just thinking about the fox as like the fox as a mythic figure, and just what we associate foxes, you know, like being cunning and sort of shape shifting, and what like these. And Alex, I know you've had a fascination with the fox, the Lady Tamamo.
My first novel.
Yeah, so I was wondering if that factored into your thinking about fox, or you know, when you were writing about foxes.
You mean for both of us?
Yeah.
You know, I didn't really have a lot of experience with live foxes until after I'd finished the novel and I moved to Germany for a fellowship in Leipzig. And so the building that they had all of the visiting faculty live in at the University of Leipzig had some foxes that lived nearby. And there was one night when I came home early in my time there when there was a fox that I kind of surprised in the courtyard of the building. And, you know, the way that I found it was that first I noticed that there was all this blood and then all these feathers. And then there was the fox. And the fox was looking at me like this, you know. And I was like, oh, you know, like I hadn't expected. I don't know what I thought an animal would be in a German city. Exactly, like what you would expect to see. I'd gotten used to the ravens, which are incredible and everywhere, but I was really not used to foxes. And then I became used to them, and came to love them. And then I went to London, and I discovered that London also had foxes. And then I thought, oh, there's some sort of like European city of the fox. Maybe it's this little idea that like a half of a theory that I came up with in my head. It was interesting to see them. I mean, on the one hand, at times they seem quite ordinary, and then they execute these like extraordinary leaps, and seem to vanish, you know. And so then I started to understand how the myths that I had loved so much when I was younger, how they had come to. It was kind of a reverse journey in some way from the mythic fox into like the real one that I personally had with it. You know, but my use of the fox in Edinburgh came from just noticing the different qualities that people would ascribe to foxes in the stories depending on where they were from. And so I was like remembering stories that my father would tell me, my Korean father, about them, and then stories that I came across in like Japanese mythology, and then stories in Korean folklore, and then in Chinese folklore also, and I started to think about like that kind of shifting set of values depending on what you thought the fox was a proxy for, I suppose. You know, desire or the foreigner, or yeah.
Were you thinking?
I guess I went the other way around too. I started with the foxes. I just really like foxes, and I really like canids, and I really like coyotes, and I really like wolves. So I was just generally terribly interested in them. And then, you know, the idea that they could act as a proxy for a certain kind of discussion came up. But in a way, what happened with happiness is that the metaphor deepened, because as I began to research coyotes, I was in, I mean, they just, you know, you have these happenstance moments with the book. I was in Williams College, and I kept finding this scat, you know, poo. And I decided, it just looked like a dog had eaten a bowl of cherries. And so I decided to investigate it. And I thought, what on earth is this? And it was coyote poo. And it was all very near my house. And I thought, there are coyotes right around here. And I was reading about urban animals and, well, what they call human-animal conflict or coexistence, depending on your position. And I was reading about it, and I found a book called Coyote at the Kitchen Door. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And I flipped over to read about the author, and the author lived about an hour and a half away. And so I asked him if he would have lunch with me. I found his email, emailed him, said, would you have lunch with me? I went, please say yes. And he said yes. And so we went to have lunch. And in that conversation, I kind of realized that I'd found the fullness of the metaphor. And in happiness, foxes and coyote, which are the most successful creature, I mean, probably apart from maybe cockroaches or something, but certainly in terms of predators, the most successful. They have outwitted absolutely every attempt to kill them off. They haven't just done it, they have grown, right? They have thrived. I mean, coyotes, you know, you kill one, another one moves into its territory, you kill two, they hyperbreed. I mean, same with foxes. You cannot do it, which is why, and this is what frustrates women. Well, I know her problem is deer, but you know, she would go crazy if she had to deal with foxes and coyotes because, you know, the wall wouldn't do anything. So they
They would dance along it.
yeah, exactly. They became, in my book, because I was writing about trauma and resilience, they became this metaphor for resilience, that actually they grew stronger through adversity. And that's one of the themes of the book, which I examine in terms of human conflicts. You know, what happens at the end of a conflict? How do people survive the end of the conflict? And are they necessarily destroyed and damaged by it? Or is there, in the human spirit, a resilience that can actually, in many cases, enable you to grow from adversity? And that is, to me, so the metaphor kind of, it deepened and grew richer as it went along.
For me, the metaphorical use of the fox in that first novel is something that I get into in this book, in the essay, autobiography of my novel, where my father had this one red hair that he would always just pull out of his head. And it was such a sort of interesting thing. And I remember after he died, we went to our sort of ancestral, our ancestral temple, which is on this little island called Naruto, where our family lived for a very long time. And it's on the side of Korea that faces towards Japan. And standing on the boat, I saw all of these people on the ferry and when the sun hit their hair, I could see these red strands. And I thought of my father. And so there's this in Japanese folklore, there's this idea that if you do have one of those red hairs, it's a sign that you are descended from a fox. You know, and so the fox in the novel eventually became like a kind of multifaceted metaphor for both like that resilience in the face of difficulty, you know, in terms of like the way in which I think about, like anytime I think, I've really got it tough, I always remember my father stealing food from overturned army trucks in Seoul during the Korean War to like feed his family to get by, and then I'm like, all right, I'm not there yet. So it, you know, like at least I'm doing better than Dad, you know, and then the other piece of it was there are all these stories about foxes taking the shapes of usually women to seduce usually men, and I couldn't ever find. It says that they could take the shapes of men or women, but I could never find a story that was about a fox taking the shape of a man, and so I wrote one. That was what Edinburgh ended up becoming.
Coyotes have that same mythology around them. I'm sure you all know it because this is your country and they are your animals. But you know, the shapeshifter, the cunning, you know, the joker, the trickster, the cunning one, but also wisdom as well. Great wisdom in Native American culture. And they're the one who the coyote is the creature that gives man fire. So it's kind of interesting how, I mean, I think each culture has one of those. In West Africa, it's Anansi, yeah, who's the spider who has exactly the same role in the culture. You know, and Anansi always wins. He gets shown up sometimes and he gets humiliated, but somehow he always survives it and carries on to live another day. His wife doesn't survive. Oh, she beats her. Yeah, she gets one over on him. Yeah. And sometimes an
She's
old
the one who
woman.
wins over Nancy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot what I was about to say. I had so many things I wanted to say. Well, I really love the that detail about in your essay about your dad having the one red hair. And I was reading about the Ainu indigenous people of Japan, and apparently they all had red hair. And
Yes, I thought about them a lot when I was writing it.
and then like my grandpa had red hair, so like I'm from Taiwan, and so we were always wondering like why he had red hair. So I relate to that a lot. And then the thing about resilience too, I think like animals are so fascinating because they've been here, you know, far longer than we have. And so like I started, like part of my fascination with writing about clams was because I'm like, oh, they've been around for 400 million years. Like they really know about resilience. Like let's see what we can learn. But it's good to know that coyotes can can go into hyperbreeding mode. Yeah.
Well, no, humans do it too, of course. We hyperbreed because that's what the baby boom was about. So it's not, you know, we are all part of the same, you know, mammalian pattern, but we do it as well. After the war, the baby boom, when people started having more babies, and no one planned that. No one said have more babies. It was a naturally occurring phenomenon. Or maybe not. I don't know. I believe it was a naturally occurring phenomenon. They were probably encouraged in some way through government, but
Yeah.
Yes, I think there was some government encouragement.
Okay, well, I have more questions, but we probably like open up to or start preparing your questions. I have one more question that I really wanted to ask. So I want to talk about trends in writing and the way that you're like that marketing around books. So Aminatta, for your book, I've read that it's often described as the new genre of nature writing, like this new nature writing genre. And then Alex, you know, autofiction is like the big hip thing right now. So how do you feel about these terms, and are they useful to you? Like, did you associate? I mean, did you feel as though you were writing this thing autofiction or autobiographical fiction or nature writing?
Well, I mean, so the title of the essay collection was a bit of a joke about that question that always gets asked when you read from a piece of fiction, and someone is like, "How autobiographical is this?" And I remember actually being just like incredibly pissed off at that question, especially with my first novel, and I think, of course, because when you're a debut author, you're not really house trained, so, someone asked the question to me, and I said, "Would it matter if you knew? Like, would you believe it more? Or would you be like, oh, that part I really believe now, because he lived through that, it seemed like a way of talking about a book that was a way of not talking about a book, a way of not addressing what the book was about, a way of avoiding the issues the writer had brought up, just a way of talking about it in the least interesting way,
Somehow people feel like it's like sexy or something, or it's like, oh, it feels more worth my while if this person actually lived through this experience. And so it's a test, to see how authentic this thing is.
I think it's the confusion of writing with therapy, actually. I think people kind of think that writers are writing for reasons to sort of self-heal. And I think that's one of the confusions. And then there's also the myth that every first novel is autobiographical. That's the second one. That gets bandied around all the time. I got asked that with my first novel. And I'd say, but I wrote a memoir first. I didn't even disguise it. I just wrote a memoir. And then I wrote a novel. And now you're asking me if the novel is autobiographical? No, the memoir is autobiographical. So no, what I want to know from you, Alex, is this, right? Now let me just quickly answer the nature question. I write about the thing that interests me most. So I didn't really set out to create a new genre of nature writing by writing about urban wildlife. I just write about the thing that interests me most. I mean, but the other thing, you can't really anticipate what people will say. I've always been terribly interested in nature, and actually the Hired Man is full of it, and the Memory of Love is full of it. It's just that those things, first of all, get overshadowed by the other subject matter, which in that particular case was war and conflict, and also just the presumption of who writes about what. And so when somebody would say to me, oh, there are lots of this or that in your book, animals, people could say, oh, you know so much about animals. And I say, I'm not as urban as I look. This is your presumption that I have lived in a high-rise all my life, but I haven't. I grew up in the third world, and I grew up, with snakes in the garden and, parrots in the trees. So, but now, the question I wanted to ask you, now that you've written fiction and non-fiction, has this been asked of you? When you write a work of fiction, the question you get asked a lot, is it autobiographical, right? How much of it is true? That's the question. When you write a work of non-fiction, the question is always, did you make any of this up?
Been asked. Ooh. Is this on? Here we go. That has not exactly been asked of me yet. And I was, throughout the process of writing it, I was pretty alert to that as a possibility.
Making it up or being asked about making it up?
Well, both. I mean,
that you might sort of
right, like
drift.
But also that people would think about it. Mm-hmm. So early on, I in my writing, or my sort of career as a student, we'll call it that, of writing, I got to hear the writer Blanche McCrary Boyd speak, and she has a new novel coming out after 20 years this summer, called the Tomb of the Unknown Racist, and it completes a trilogy, which I wasn't ever sure that I would live to see completed. I'm really thrilled about this. But anyway, so that summer she dropped some wisdom on us, and she said, if your fiction is good enough, people will believe that you really lived through it. And if your nonfiction is good enough, people will believe you made it up. And so I remember at the time, I was like this 20-year-old student of writing, and I thought, oh, what is the point of writing for these people? But it was also like, also at the same time, I remember also studying with Annie Dillard, who was very clear about, like, how the dangers of making things up, and writers who had had terrible scandals for having been caught out at having created a composite, like Bruce Chatwin. Um, and so it was, as much as possible, I have tried to be very clear about what I am imagining about someone and what I am not. And the conversations that I relate in the collection are as close to what I remember as possible. And in some cases, where possible, I have sought out the people. And like when I was quoting Deborah Eisenberg in the essay about being at Iowa, I reached out to her by email and asked her about what I recollected and what she would be comfortable with, and so on. And so it's I tried as much to work in that way as possible to avoid that.
Some writers do freely admit to making things up. I am like you. I keep my fiction is fiction, my non-fiction is non-fiction, right? So with my fiction, don't rely on it, right? I mean, I would have done my best with the facts, but the people don't exist. So and I'll play around with locations and things like that, depending on what it is I'm trying to achieve. So in The Hired Man, the town doesn't exist, except that it sort of does exist. I took a town and played around with it a bit. And then I put a clue in, so that Croatians get, but most other readers don't notice. So, I can be tricksy with my fiction, but I'm not tricksy with my non-fiction. I keep very clear lines about it. And I think the reason that this is so important, and I know, there are plenty of writers who admit to making it up, to making things up and think that it doesn't matter. And perhaps in the, I take the view, well, that's their, it's their writing. I can't, that's the position they take. For me, the reason it's so important not to make things up is because what I think that when somebody opens a book, when a reader opens a book, and you as a writer have delivered it to them, you are both, you're making a contract with them as the writer, right? That's what you're doing. You're making a contract with them, and to me, the contract with fiction is, don't worry, don't go and live your life by this, right? Take from it what you will, but this is one long lie, basically. Whereas non-fiction, I am saying that to the best of my ability, I am telling a true story, and I think that's different. So once you start making things up, you undermine that contract, and then where does the reader stand with it? They don't know where they stand any longer.
There's also an epistemological pleasure, right, in the way that you create it. Also, like the joy of invention versus the joy of that kind of archaeology of the self or of the event or the other person. Where you are at, like, I think of it as a confrontation with just how strange the world is when I am writing nonfiction, and just how much I lie to myself anyway. My whole writing process is created out of this like deep distrust of my own recollections and my own account of things. So
I feel like even nonfiction narratives can be a little bit wobbly, because I was just thinking of this like really great detail in your book about the parakeets and where they come from. So everyone's like, every country has that has parakeets, wild ones, has like their own origin story about where the parakeets came from, and many of the stories are like, oh, it was because like someone filmed a James Bond set around here, and then they had to like populate it with parakeets. But so it's like, and then they all escaped, and so that's why we have these populations of wild parakeets. But like, if you were writing a nonfiction, you would get to choose, like, if you were writing nonfiction, you would get to choose which one, like which story to honor.
Actually, one of the things I learned writing non-fiction is that you don't always get the answer, and you have to make your story of the pieces that you have. Whereas fiction, you make up the pieces, you build the pieces, and then you build the structure. In non-fiction, the pieces are given to you, or you find them, but they exist. The thing, a wise writer, it was Gillian Slovo, who wrote Every Secret Thing about her parents who were activists in South Africa. She just said, take the reader into your confidence. Say, I don't know. You know, I don't know this, or I have heard this. So the two stories about the parakeets, one of them was that they were filming a James Bond movie in Pinewood Studios in London, and and somebody left the doors open of a jungle scene, and all the birds escaped, and the parakeets somehow survived the winter, whereas the other birds of paradise died away. And then the other story is that they were all little individual escapees, right, who flew out of people's houses. I mean, I don't know which story is crazier, but the thing about the James Bond story is that when I moved to America and I told somebody that story, she said, oh yeah, we've got the same story except it's Petco. Somebody left the cages open in Petco.
Escape from Petco?
Yeah. I mean, the individual parakeets one is the one I'm sort of putting my money on, because I actually did meet a woman looking for her individual parakeet. When I was in where I lived, there was a great big tree and I did use this in the book. I don't know if they chopped it down for the same reasons, but there's this big tree where the parakeets live. And I did actually find a woman when I was in the park, and she said, where's the parakeet tree? And I took it to her, and she said that she'd accidentally opened the cage of her dad's parakeet, and he was in hospital. She was looking after the parakeet. She'd opened the cage, and the bird had flown out of the window, and she was there trying to call it back. Yeah. And then I think the moment she saw the colony of parakeets, you know, a sort of 200 strong colony of parakeets, she realized that was probably never going to happen. Her parakeet had found a new life.
I think we have parakeets that live in Greenwood.
Greenwood Cemetery,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, questions. How many do we have time for? 2.
Really?
You got the first one.
I'm Cassie, and I'm a graduate student at Sarah Lawrence. This is kind of a fun question. After you having your first book published, did your writing process change at all? And if so, how?
I wrote a memoir first, and then I went to work on a novel. Did my writing process change very much? I found the novel, I found them both hard, but in different ways, really.
Right, because the nonfiction and the
Yeah,
fiction.
you know, and as I said, I
there's
had the
limitations.
pieces for the nonfiction.
Right.
And once I'd sort of found my way into it, I could actually go into my room and get a lot written. Whereas fiction is much more, you know, plucking it out of the air. But no, I think I was a journalist for 10 years, so I just really have learned to sit down and get on with it, however awful it feels, and get something down on paper. I think the one thing I did learn about, the one detail that changed, you know, you were talking about writer's block earlier on. I didn't get writer's block, but you could get stuck on a certain passage, which doesn't really happen so much with nonfiction, because you know where your story is headed. So what I learned to do was just write a bit ahead. You know, I just write a scene I know, and then usually your brain starts to work in such a way that brings that, that brings the rest of the plot into focus.
I think for me, the changes in my writing process were more something I could attribute to the changes in the technology around writing. So like when I started out, I was using a typewriter, and then gradually I was using an electric typewriter, and then I was in Maine.
How old are you?
I'm 50.
First of all, I was using a quill.
I'm 50. 50, yeah. I use a lot of sunblock. The beard helps too. Anyway, so yeah, and then then eventually like laptops and computers. Yeah. So the thing that I had to address was this way in which, with a typewriter, when you stop writing, you are right where you stopped. And when you go back, you're like, oh, here I am again, and you pick up again. But with a computer, you would close maybe the laptop or close the document. If you close the document and open it up again, you're at the beginning again. And so, I remember like the sort of this summer that I was working on Edinburgh, and I just like ruined the first 35 pages for months, just because every time I just wasn't used to that part of I hadn't learned how to get around that, and so I think that was part of it. And a lot of what I went back to eventually was sort of old things like retyping something as a way of editing it, because you would make like 30 decisions instead of 5, and they would all be interventions that you needed to make. But also, retyping allowed me to create a sort of finite process also, because with the Word document, you're potentially just in there forever. People are like, how do you know when it's done? And I'm like, it's very hard to know. And there's actually this phenomenon that I've noticed where you'll be like, I am done, and you mail it to your editor, and then as soon as you do, you're like, oh my God, what have I done? And you think of like all the things that are wrong with it that were invisible to you until you hit send. And it's very strange. And there's not like, how many people have had this happen? Yeah. So, anyway, I won't belabor that piece of it, but that definitely, it helps, I guess, to send something to an agent in the process, and to tell her in advance, like,
I'm done when I can't look at it anymore. That's
Yeah.
basically when I'm done.
that's true. The loathing arrives where you're like,
But with happiness, for the first time ever, I didn't send it straight off. I left it for 6 weeks, and then I sent it off. You know why? Partly what you're talking about, right? That I just knew. I knew that the minute it went, I'd start thinking, oh, that. And I thought, well, why don't I just have that thought while it's still in the bottom drawer instead of in the metaphorical bottom drawer, of course.
I like this step. I'm going to adopt this.
But the other thing, and actually, some things did change. I stopped loathing it so much, you see, because it was just lying there in the drawer and I wasn't having to go to it every day. But then the other thing was, I knew that as soon as I sent it to my publisher, it would come back, right? They would edit it and it would come straight back. And I just didn't, I just didn't feel like I could go back.
You just wanted a minute.
Yeah, exactly.
6 weeks.
It's like a boyfriend. Just can we take a break? Wouldn't that be nice?
All right.
One more question. Okay, because it means we're done if there's no more questions. No more.
To the wine.
To the wine. Thank
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. Thank you.